They set the table I paid for, in the house I helped keep, and then they asked me to leave before the food got cold. I remember standing on that porch in November with no coat, listening to my own family laugh through the window like I had never existed. I had cooked for 3 days. I had driven 4 hours. I had spent money I needed for rent just to be in that room, at that table, with those people. And still they chose him over me. The worst part was not the cold. The worst part was that I was not even surprised. And the part that changed everything, the part none of them saw coming, started with a single phone call I received while sitting in my car in that driveway, shaking. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something real. If the people who were supposed to love you most asked you to leave on the one night of the year built around family, would you go quietly, or would you finally stop protecting them? Think about that as you listen, because Emily had to answer that question in real time, in the dark, with no plan and nowhere to go. Let's go back to where it all started. Emily was 31 years old the Thanksgiving she got pushed out of her own family's life. She was not a dramatic person. She was not the kind of woman who started arguments or kept score out loud. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, who showed up early to help set up, who stayed late to clean without being asked. She was the kind of woman who sent money when she had it and showed up with groceries when she did not. She had been doing this her whole life, not because she was weak, but because she genuinely loved her family and believed, deep in a place she never examined too closely, that love was something you earned by being useful. Her family was made up of her mother Sandra, her older brother Derek, Derek's wife Pamela, and their 2 kids, plus a rotating cast of cousins and aunts who showed up when there was something to celebrate and disappeared when there was work to be done. Emily was the youngest. She was also the most reliable, the most educated, and the one who had spent the last 4 years quietly funding things she was never given credit for. She had helped pay off a debt Derek owed to keep the family home from being seized. She had covered 3 months of her mother's mortgage when Sandra lost her part-time job. She had bought the dining room table they were all planning to sit around that Thanksgiving, though by then most of them had forgotten that detail. Emily worked as a project manager for a mid-sized logistics company. She was good at her job. She was methodical, she planned ahead, and she had a gift for anticipating problems before they became disasters. She had tried to apply those same skills to her family relationships for years, always sensing a tension before it broke, always smoothing things over before they became ugly. What she had not yet learned, at 31, was that sometimes when you are always the one smoothing things over, the people around you stop believing there is anything to smooth. They start treating calm as permission. The man who changed the Thanksgiving equation was named Marcus. Marcus was Derek's college friend who had moved back to town 6 months earlier after a difficult divorce. Emily had met him twice. Both times she had felt a low, unspecific discomfort around him that she could not explain and chose not to examine. He was charming in the way that made her guard go up rather than down. He laughed a little too easily at things that were not funny. He had a way of entering a room and immediately repositioning himself as the most important person in it. Derek loved him. Sandra thought he was delightful. Pamela called him a breath of fresh air. Emily had not been told Marcus would be at Thanksgiving dinner. She had driven 4 hours from her apartment in the city, arriving Wednesday evening to help her mother prepare. She had brought 2 bags of groceries, a pie she had baked herself starting at 6 in the morning, and an envelope with $200 she planned to quietly leave on Sandra's counter because she knew her mother's heating bill was going to be painful that winter. She had not planned to make a big deal of any of it. She never did. Sandra seemed distracted when Emily arrived. She hugged her quickly, thanked her for the groceries with a vague wave toward the kitchen, and then disappeared back into the living room where the television was on. Emily put everything away herself. She cleaned the counters. She started the prep for the next day. She was elbow-deep in peeling sweet potatoes when Derek came in through the back door, arms full of beer, talking loudly on his phone. He saw her and nodded. He did not help. He did not thank her. He went back to his phone call and disappeared into the basement. By 10 that night, Emily had done the brining, set out the dishes, organized the refrigerator, and washed everything that needed to be washed. Her back ached. Her feet hurt. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at the room she had put back together and felt something she would later describe as the particular loneliness of being taken for granted by people who should have known better. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and gray. Emily was up at 6. She started the turkey. She made the cornbread. She worked steadily and quietly while the rest of the house slept, and when Sandra finally came downstairs at 8:30, she looked at the kitchen and said, simply, "You did all that already?" Emily said yes. Sandra poured herself a coffee and went to sit in the other room. That was the whole exchange. Derek and Pamela arrived with the kids around noon. The kids ran through the kitchen. Pamela complimented the smell and asked if the green beans were going to have almonds because she was not sure her youngest would eat them with almonds, and could Emily make a separate portion without? Emily said of course. She made a separate portion. Marcus arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Emily heard the front door open and heard her brother's big, booming greeting, and then she heard a voice she recognized and felt that same unspecific discomfort rise up in her chest. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked out to say hello. Marcus was standing in the entryway with a bottle of wine and a wide smile. He made eye contact with Emily and his smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that reminded her of a person who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the moment to act on it. Dinner was set for 3. Emily had the whole thing timed perfectly. She brought everything to the table herself because by that point it was simply easier than asking anyone to help and waiting to see who actually would. The table looked beautiful. The food was hot. Everything was exactly right. They sat down. Sandra was at the head of the table. Derek was to her right. Pamela was next to Derek. The kids were at the kids' end. Marcus had been placed directly across from Emily, which meant that every time she looked up from her plate, she was looking at him. The first part of dinner was fine, or fine enough. There was the usual noise. The kids argued about something small. Derek told a story about work that went on too long. Pamela talked about a renovation they were planning. Sandra laughed at things Marcus said with a warmth Emily had not heard her direct at anyone in a long time, certainly not at Emily. Marcus had a way of talking that made everything feel like a performance and made everyone in the audience feel lucky to be watching. Emily ate her food and said little. She was tired from 2 days of work and 4 hours of driving, and she was starting to feel the particular weight of someone who has given a lot and is not sure anyone has noticed. It was Marcus who started it. He turned the conversation to real estate, which seemed innocent enough at first. He had opinions about the housing market. He had thoughts about investment. Then he mentioned, with a casual air, that he had been looking at properties in Emily's city and had actually driven past her neighborhood recently, which struck Emily as odd because she had never told him where she lived. She mentioned this. She kept her voice light. She said she did not remember sharing her address. Marcus smiled and said Derek had given it to him, that he had just been curious about the area. Emily looked at Derek. Derek shrugged and said he had not thought it was a big deal. Emily said nothing more about it. But something settled in her chest, a cold and specific feeling, a recognition that this was not the first time Derek had shared something about her life without asking her. The conversation moved on. Marcus talked more. He was good at keeping the table's attention and he knew it. At some point he made a comment about Emily's job, something vague and slightly condescending about logistics being a safe but uninspiring career choice, the kind of thing a person says when they want to diminish someone without leaving fingerprints. Emily responded calmly. She mentioned her most recent project, the scope of it, the team she managed, the outcome. She was not boasting. She was simply refusing to be minimized without a fight. Marcus laughed, a charming, dismissive laugh, and changed the subject. Sandra did not say anything. Derek laughed along with Marcus. Pamela looked at her plate. After dessert, Emily went to the kitchen to start cleaning up. She was rinsing dishes when she heard Derek's voice from the living room shift in tone. It became quieter, more serious. She could not hear exact words at first. She turned off the water and listened. She heard her name. She heard something about the house. She heard Marcus say something about an opportunity. She dried her hands and walked to the doorway. What she walked into was a conversation she had not been invited to. Derek and Marcus were sitting forward on the couch, Sandra in her armchair, all three of them looking at something on Marcus's phone. When Emily appeared in the doorway, the conversation stopped. There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. Emily asked what was going on. Sandra said it was nothing, they were just talking. Derek said Marcus had an idea about the house that he wanted to share with the family. Emily stepped into the room. She asked what kind of idea. Marcus looked at her with that same calm, confident expression and explained that he was putting together a small real estate investment group, that he had identified the family home as a strong candidate for a conversion project, that with Sandra's agreement, the property could be restructured in a way that would generate income for everyone involved. He said this as though Emily were already part of the conversation, as though she had been sitting there the whole time. Emily asked her mother directly, when had this conversation started? Sandra said Marcus had mentioned it a few weeks ago, that Derek had been helping him think it through, and that they had not wanted to bring it up until they had more details. A few weeks ago, her brother and her mother had been having financial conversations about the family property with a man Emily barely knew, a man who had looked up her neighborhood without telling her, a man whose divorce Emily had quietly researched online and found was considerably less simple than the friendly story Marcus had told at the table. She had found a small news item about a civil dispute connected to Marcus's name and a business that had dissolved messily. She had not mentioned it because she had not thought it was her place. She was rethinking that decision now. She stayed calm. She said she had some concerns about the plan. She said she would like to understand more before anyone made decisions. She said she thought it would be worth looking into Marcus's background more carefully given the stakes involved. That was when the room changed. Derek stood up. He told Emily that she always did this, that she always made things difficult, that Marcus was a good person and a good friend, and she was being suspicious for no reason. His voice was the hot, immediate kind of angry that told Emily this defense had been prepared in advance, that he had expected her to object, and had decided before she even spoke that her objection would be treated as the problem rather than the thing she was objecting to. Sandra told Emily to calm down. Emily said she was calm. She said she was simply asking questions. Marcus said nothing. He sat back slightly and watched. Pamela took the children out of the room. Derek said if Emily was going to come into this house and immediately start attacking people, then maybe she needed some time to think outside. He said it half-jokingly, the way people say the cruelest things, wrapped in a tone that gives them an escape route if the target protests. But his eyes were serious, and Sandra was not contradicting him. Emily looked at her mother. She waited. She had been waiting her whole life for her mother to step in at the right moment, to choose the fair thing, to look at her daughter standing in a doorway asking a reasonable question and say that the question deserved a reasonable answer. Sandra said, "Derek, don't be dramatic." And then she said to Emily, "Maybe just give us a few minutes, sweetheart. Maybe just give us a few minutes," as if Emily were the disruption, as if the concern was the problem and not the thing causing it. Emily went to the kitchen. She stood there for a moment, then she put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked back through the living room and said she was going to get some air. No one stopped her. No one looked up. She walked out the front door and onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind her and stood in the cold November dark, listening to the muffled sounds of her family rearranging themselves around her absence. She sat on the porch steps for a few minutes. Then she went to her car. She sat in the driver's seat with the heat running and tried to decide what she was feeling. She was not crying, which surprised her. She was not even particularly angry yet. She was something quieter and more clarifying than anger. She was finally seeing something she had been looking away from for a very long time, seeing it clearly, the way you sometimes see a photograph develop in your hands and the image becomes undeniable. She had spent years being the dependable one. She had spent years arriving early, staying late, paying quietly, fixing things without credit. She had believed she was doing it out of love, and maybe she had been once. But she was beginning to understand that she had also been doing it out of fear that if she stopped being useful, they would stop choosing her. And sitting in her car in her mother's driveway on Thanksgiving night, she had just watched T. Hem choose her replacement while she was still in the room. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Derek. It said, "You should probably just head home tonight. Give everyone space to breathe." She read it twice. She looked at the house. The lights in the living room were warm and the curtains were partially open, and she could see shapes moving inside. She could see Marcus's silhouette, leaning forward, talking. She started the car. Before she could decide whether to drive away or walk back inside, her phone rang. Not Derek, not her mother. The number was one she recognized but had not expected. It was her Aunt Ruth, Sandra's older sister, who lived alone about 20 minutes away and had not come to dinner that year because she was recovering from a knee surgery. Ruth was 70 years old, sharp as a tack, and had always occupied a particular role in the family as the person everyone underestimated and no one thought to be careful around. Emily answered. Ruth said, "Are you at your mother's?" Emily said she was in the driveway. Ruth said, "Come here." There was something in the way she said it, not a question, not exactly in order, but the specific tone of a person who has information and understands the weight of it. Emily backed out of the driveway. She drove to Ruth's house. She knocked on the door and Ruth opened it wearing slippers and reading glasses and an expression Emily had never quite seen on her before, careful, measured, and not unkind. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table. Ruth made tea. She set a tin of cookies between them and folded her hands and looked at Emily for a long moment. Then she told her. Ruth had known about Marcus longer than anyone in the immediate family. She had met him once, years ago, through a friend of a friend, long before he and Derek had reconnected. She had heard his name come up in a property dispute in their town a decade back, something involving an elderly couple who had signed documents they had not fully understood and found themselves with significantly less ownership than they had started with. Ruth had never had proof of wrongdoing, nothing she could point to and call criminal, but she had never forgotten the name. When Derek had introduced Marcus back into family life 6 months ago, Ruth had felt the hair stand up on the back of her neck. She had tried to raise this with Sandra. Sandra had brushed her off. Ruth was too negative, Sandra said. Ruth was suspicious of everyone. Ruth said she had then spent 4 months quietly doing something she was not proud of, but did not regret, which was gathering information. She had called the friend of a friend. She had written a careful letter to a retired attorney she knew. She had found the name of the couple from the old property dispute and located their daughter, who was still angry enough to talk. And what Ruth had assembled, piece by careful piece, was a picture of a man who made a practice of identifying families with property and emotional vulnerabilities and inserting himself into their trust before anyone thought to look at his hands. She slid a manila folder across the table. Emily opened it. She spent 20 minutes reading. Ruth sat quietly and let her read. The folder contained copies of public records, a printout of the civil case from a decade ago, a typed summary of a phone call Ruth had had with the daughter of the elderly couple, and a single handwritten note from the retired attorney that said, in plain and careful language, that the restructuring approach Marcus used had been designed to look like a benefit to all parties while quietly positioning himself as the central decision-maker in a property arrangement that would eventually be very difficult to exit. Emily closed the folder. She looked at her aunt. Ruth said, "I wanted to tell you before anything was signed. I did not know he was going to bring this up tonight." Emily said, "Has he already started the paperwork?" Ruth said she did not know. She said Sandra had mentioned, about 2 weeks ago, a conversation about power of attorney, something Sandra had described as routine, and that Ruth had not been able to get more details on. Power of attorney. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the November air. She thought about her mother, alone, occasionally confused, longing for company and attention, being charmed by a man who sat in her living room and made her feel important. She thought about a document Sandra might sign without fully understanding, or sign because Derek told her it was fine, or sign because the man asking had a very easy smile and a very persuasive manner. She took a photograph of every document in the folder with her phone. She thanked Ruth. She hugged her carefully around the shoulder. Ruth held on a second longer than usual and said, "You've always been the one who paid attention, Emily. That's not nothing." Emily sat in her car outside Ruth's house for a long time. She was thinking the way she did at work when a project had gone wrong, and she needed to understand not just what had failed, but every upstream decision that had led to the failure. Because fixing the surface problem without understanding its roots only meant it would grow back in a different shape. She was thinking about what she knew, what she could prove, what she could not prove, and what she needed to do in what order. She was also thinking about the text from Derek that was still sitting unanswered on her phone. She thought about how simply and cleanly he had sent it, not angry, not sorry, just matter of fact, the way you text someone about logistics. Head home. Give everyone space. As though she were a house guest whose visit had run slightly long. As though 4 hours of driving and 3 days of invisible labor were a footnote. She did not text back, not yet. She drove to a motel 12 minutes away. She paid for one night. She lay on the bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and made a list in her head of every practical thing she needed to do. She was very good at lists. She was very good at breaking a problem into steps and working through them without letting emotion make her move too fast or in the wrong direction. She had learned this skill at work. She was about to apply it somewhere it mattered considerably more than any project deadline. The first thing she needed to do was understand the legal situation around the family home. The property was in Sandra's name. Sandra was of sound mind, as far as Emily knew, though she had been increasingly reliant on Derek for practical decisions over the last 2 years, citing her bad knees and her difficulty driving long distances, and, Emily now realized, the particular exhaustion of being the person everyone expected to hold things together. Sandra had given Derek informal authority over several household matters without anyone formalizing anything, which meant that any documentation Marcus was pursuing would probably have gone through Derek as the primary contact. Emily pulled up the county property records website on her phone. She found the listing for her mother's address. The property was still in Sandra's name alone. There were no liens, no recent title changes, and no recorded documents that suggested a restructuring had already occurred. That was something. That meant there was still time, but she did not know how much. The second thing she needed to do was talk to someone with legal knowledge. Not just the retired attorney in Ruth's notes, though she planned to call him. She had a coworker named Diane whose husband was a real estate attorney, and Emily had helped Diane through a difficult project stretched 6 months ago in a way Diane had said she would not forget. It was Thanksgiving night. Emily still composed a careful text to Diane explaining the situation in plain terms, apologizing for the timing, and asking whether her husband might have 10 minutes the following morning. She pressed send and put her phone face down on the nightstand. The third thing she needed to do was much harder. She needed to think clearly about her mother. Not with resentment, not with the fresh wound of being asked to leave the table still stinging, but clearly. Sandra was not a villain. Sandra was a woman who was lonely and tired, and had raised 2 children more or less alone after their father left, and who had spent so many years holding things together that, when a charming, attentive man came along and made her feel like everything was handled, she had let herself relax into that feeling the way a person lets themselves be led into a room that looks warm without checking whether there is a way out. Emily understood this. She had spent her whole life watching her mother make choices driven by the need to feel safe and loved, and she had watched those choices cost Sandra things she did not know she was losing until they were already gone. Emily did not want her mother to lose the house. She did not want her mother to sign something that handed a stranger the keys to the family's most significant asset under the cover of a helpful arrangement. And she did not want to destroy her relationship with her mother while trying to prevent it. But she also understood, lying in that motel room on Thanksgiving night, that she could not protect her mother by being quiet any longer. Quiet had not worked. Calm had not worked. Being useful and present and reliable had not created the protective relationship she had hoped it would. Her mother had sat in her armchair and told Emily to give them a few minutes. Her brother had sent her a text message asking her to leave. Neither of them was going to choose her over Marcus on the basis of loyalty alone, because the loyalty Emily had built was invisible to them. They had stopped seeing it the same way they had stopped seeing the kitchen she cleaned and the table she had bought. She was going to have to show them something they I'll not ignore. She thought about the envelope with $200 she had left on Sandra's kitchen counter. She got up. She texted Derek, "I forgot something at Mom's. I'll be by to get it in the morning." She put the phone down and went asleep. She woke early. She called Diane at 7:30, apologizing again for the hour. Diane answered on the second ring and said her husband, Patrick, had already seen the text and was willing to talk. Emily explained the situation in full. Patrick asked her several precise questions. He told her that what she was describing, if the paperwork had not yet been signed, was preventable. He used the word undue influence carefully and explained what it meant in the context of property and estate decisions involving vulnerable adults. He said he could not give her formal legal advice without being retained, but that there were some very clear steps she should take immediately if she wanted to protect her mother's position. He told her to get a copy of any documents her mother had already seen or signed. He told her to ensure her mother spoke to an independent attorney before any further paperwork was initiated. He told her to document everything she knew, with dates. He told her that if there was evidence suggesting Marcus had misrepresented his intentions or background, that evidence should be preserved carefully. Emily thanked him. She told him she would be in touch. She meant it. She drove to her mother's house at 9 in the morning. Derek's car was not there. She knocked. Sandra answered in a bathrobe. She looked startled to see Emily and then immediately adopted the particular expression of a person who is about to manage a situation rather than be present in it. Emily said, "Mom, I need to talk to you. Just you, can I come in?" Sandra stood back and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the kitchen Emily had cleaned the night before, the kitchen that still smelled faintly of Thanksgiving, the kitchen that had the envelope with $200 sitting exactly where Emily had left it because no one had moved it. Emily did not start with the envelope, she started with the folder. She put her phone on the table and showed her mother the photographs of Ruth's documents. She walked through them slowly. She did not use an emotional tone. She used the same clear, methodical voice she used in project briefings at work, the voice that said, "I have organized this information for you, and I need you to understand it before we make any decisions." She explained the civil case. She explained the property dispute from a decade ago. She explained the daughter who had been willing to talk. She explained what a power of attorney meant in practical terms and why the timing of that conversation. While Marcus was actively cultivating a new relationship with Sandra and Derek, was something that needed to be examined very carefully. Sandra listened. She did not interrupt. Her expression moved through several things: surprise, discomfort, the particular look of someone hearing information they wish they had not been given because receiving it means they now have to do something about it. When Emily finished, Sandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Derek said you were always trying to make things difficult." Emily said, "I know he did, Mom. Do you think that's what this is?" Another long silence. Sandra said, "I haven't signed anything." Emily said, "Not yet, but he asked you about power of attorney." Sandra said he had mentioned it in passing. She said she had not thought much of it. Emily said, "I need you to promise me you won't sign anything, any document related to this house, without talking to an attorney first. An independent one, not one Marcus or Derek recommends. Can you promise me that?" Sandra looked at her daughter. Something moved through her face that Emily could not quite name. It was not simple. It was not apology. It was something more complicated than either of those things. It was the look of a woman seeing clearly after a period of comfortable fog and finding the clarity both necessary and painful. She said, "Okay, I promise." Emily did not push further. She stood up. She took the envelope with $200 and put it in her pocket because she needed it more than she had realized the night before. She picked up her bag. Sandra said, "Emily." Emily stopped. Sandra said, "I shouldn't have asked you to leave." It was a small thing to say. It was not enough, not for the full accounting, but it was true, and Sandra had said it without being prompted, and Emily understood that for her mother, that was significant. Emily said, "I know, Mom." She walked to the door, she paused. "Don't sign anything and call Ruth." She got in her car and drove back toward the city. About 2 hours into the drive, Derek called. She let it ring. He called again. She let it ring again. Then he sent a text. "Mom told me what you said. We need to talk." She texted back. "Kay, yes, we do. When you're ready to listen instead of manage me, I'm here." He did not respond immediately. She kept driving. By the time she got back to her apartment, 3 things had happened. First, her mother had called Ruth. Second, Derek had called Marcus. Third, Marcus had called Derek back and said that he thought it was probably best if he stepped back from the family situation for now, that he did not want to cause any friction, and that he was sure Derek understood. He had said this calmly, pleasantly, and with exactly the right note of gracious withdrawal, which told Emily everything she needed to know about how practiced he was at recognizing when a target had become too complicated to be worth the effort. Ruth called Emily that evening. She said Sandra had cried, the kind of crying that comes from realizing you almost made a very large mistake, and the only thing that stopped you was the person you had just asked to leave the room. Ruth said Sandra had asked her to pass along that she was sorry, that she understood if Emily needed time, and that she would like to talk when Emily was ready. Emily said she would be ready soon. She was not ready yet, but soon. She spent the following week focused on practical things. She wrote up everything she knew about Marcus in a clear, organized document: the civil case, the property dispute, the daughter's account as relayed through Ruth's notes, the timeline of his involvement with her family. She sent it to Patrick, who had agreed to look it over. Patrick said that, while there was nothing that rose to the level of immediate criminal concern, the pattern she had documented was the kind of thing that would be worth bringing to the attention of certain consumer protection channels, and that he knew someone at the state attorney general's office who handled financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. He said it did not need to be a formal complaint at this stage, but putting the information on record meant it would be there if Marcus turned up in another family's life and someone started looking. Emily submitted the documentation. She did not feel righteous about it. She felt practical. It was the right thing to do with the information she had, and doing it quietly and carefully was far more effective than doing it loudly. Loud was Marcus's territory. Quiet, organized, methodical action was Emily's. She called Derek on a Tuesday night, 10 days after Thanksgiving. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting. He started talking before she could. He said he was sorry. He said he had not known about Marcus's background, that he had thought he was doing something good for the family, that he had been trying to solve a problem Emily had not known about, which was that their mother's finances were more stretched than anyone had realized, and Derek had been terrified and had not known how to ask for help, and Marcus had seemed like an answer. Emily listened to all of this. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "Derek, why didn't you come to me?" He was quiet. She said, "I've been helping Mom financially for 4 years. I've been doing it quietly because I didn't want to make anyone feel bad about it. I paid a debt that would have cost us the house. I covered 3 months of mortgage payments. I bought the table you were all sitting around on Thanksgiving. I have never once said any of this out loud because I thought showing up was enough. I thought being reliable was a way of saying I love you." Derek was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know about all of that." Emily said, "I know you didn't. That's something I need to think about too, why I kept it all so quiet that the people I was doing it for didn't even know it was happening. But Derek, when I walked into that room and asked a reasonable question about a man you had invited into Mom's financial life without telling me, you told me to go outside. You sent me a text telling me to go home, on Thanksgiving, after I had cooked the entire meal." He said, "I know." She said, "I need you to understand what that was, not just what it felt like, what it actually was." He said he understood. She did not know yet whether that was true, but she believed he was trying to mean it. She said there were some things that needed to happen going forward. She said she was willing to help figure out their mother's financial situation, but she was not willing to do it invisibly anymore. She said she wanted to have an honest, full conversation with Sandra and Derek together about what had been given and what was needed and what was fair. She said she was not keeping score, but she was done pretending the score did not exist. She said she was not angry anymore, or not only angry. She was clear. Derek said yes. He said he would make it happen. Sandra called 2 days later. It was a longer call than any they had had in years. Sandra cried again. Emily did not cry, not on the call. She W. As patient and specific and honest in a way she had never let herself be with her mother before, because she had always been afraid that honesty would damage the relationship. And now she understood that the relationship had already been damaged by the absence of it. Sandra said she had called the attorney Patrick recommended. She had gone alone, without telling Derek first. The attorney had walked her through her options, explained her property rights in clear terms, and told her that no document she signed should ever be signed under pressure or without her full understanding. Sandra said it had felt like the first time in years that someone had talked to her like an adult about her own life. Emily said she was glad. She meant it. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Emily drove back to her mother's house. It was a Saturday. Derek was there. They sat at the kitchen table, the table Emily had bought, and they had the conversation she had needed to have for 4 years. She talked about what she had given. She talked about it without making it an accusation, just a statement of record. Derek talked about the fear he had been carrying about their mother's situation, a fear he had carried alone because he had not known how to share it with the one person who might have actually been able to help. Sandra listened and occasionally said things that were small and real and more honest than anything she had said to Emily in a long time. It was not a perfect conversation. It was not a tearful reunion with music playing. It was 3 people at a table figuring out what was true and what they were going to do about it. Emily had spent her whole life hoping for dramatic proof of love from the people she loved. She was learning, slowly, that the real proof was less dramatic. It was showing up to a difficult conversation. It was admitting a mistake without being forced. It was choosing the harder, honest thing over the easier, comfortable silence. She did not forgive everything that day. She was not built for sudden, total forgiveness, and she no longer believed it was required of her. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, was something that happened over time, in small movements, when the people who had hurt you actually started behaving differently. She was willing to give time to that process. She was not willing to pretend the process had already happened. She drove home with a lighter feeling that was not happiness exactly, but was something more durable than happiness. It was the feeling of a person who has finally stopped carrying something that was never theirs to carry alone. Over the following months, things changed in concrete ways. Emily and Derek started talking about their mother's finances openly. They set up a shared understanding of what needed to happen and how they would each contribute. Emily stopped funding things anonymously. When she helped, she said so, not to claim credit, but to make visible the labor that had been invisible for so long. Derek began showing up in small but meaningful ways, checking in on Sandra himself instead of routing everything through Emily, actually thanking her when she did something rather than treating it as the expected background condition of Emily's existence. Sandra thrived slowly in the new clarity. She seemed lighter when the anxious, people-pleasing energy around Marcus was gone. She started taking a water aerobics class on Wednesday mornings. She called Emily twice a week instead of waiting for Emily to call her. She sent a card on Emily's birthday that said, in Sandra's looping handwriting, "I don't tell you enough. I'm trying to do better. I love you." Emily kept the card. Marcus had drifted entirely out of Derek's orbit within 2 months of Thanksgiving. Derek had realized, in the sober aftermath of everything, that the reconnection had always had a particular quality to it, always circling back to the house, always finding ways to be around Sandra when the conversation turned to property or money or plans. He had been too close to see it while it was happening. Emily did not rub this in. She did not need to. The documentation she had submitted through Patrick's contact resulted in Marcus being flagged in a consumer protection database, not arrested, not charged, but flagged, part of a file that now existed where before there had been nothing. Emily was told about this in a brief email from the contact at the Attorney General's office. She read the email at her kitchen table, alone, on a Tuesday morning in February. She made herself a second cup of coffee. She looked out the window at the winter light. She thought about the woman who had stood on that porch on Thanksgiving night with no coat, listening to her family laugh through the window. She thought about how that woman had walked to her car and sat in the cold with a phone in her hand and chosen to drive toward information instead of away from pain. She had not been perfect. She had been too quiet for too long. E had confused being needed with being loved, and she had let that confusion cost her things, time, money, energy, and a certain amount of her own self-worth that she was still in the process of recovering. But she had done the harder thing at the harder moment, and she had done it without screaming, without cruelty, without revenge in the ugly sense of the word. She had simply stopped allowing the story to be told without her real voice in it. She thought about Aunt Ruth, who had spent 4 months gathering information nobody wanted to believe, who had pressed it into Emily's hands at a kitchen table with tea and cookies, and the trust that Emily would know what to do with it. She was going to buy Ruth something nice for Christmas. She was going to call her more often. Some people in your life saw you clearly before you learned to see yourself that way, and that deserved to be honored. She thought about something Derek had said in their long conversation in January, when they were getting to the end of the hard part and approaching the place where something new might grow. He had said, "I think I stopped seeing you because you made everything look easy, like you didn't need anything, like you just handled it." And Emily had thought about that for a long time afterward, because she understood exactly how that had happened, and she understood that she had participated in it. She had made herself look like she did not need anything because she was afraid that needing things would make people love her less. She had made her help look effortless because she wanted to be valued and had confused value with invulnerability. She was working on that. She was learning to ask for things out loud. She was learning that needing help was not the same as being a burden. She was learning that the people worth keeping in her life were the ones who did not require her to be invulnerable in order to deserve their attention. She was not all the way there yet, but she was further along than she had been on Thanksgiving night, standing in the cold, pretending she was not cold. She put her coffee mug in the sink. She picked up her phone. She called Derek because they had plans to take their mother to a doctor's appointment that afternoon, and she wanted to confirm the time. Derek answered on the second ring. They talked for a few minutes. It was easy. It was not perfect. It was never going to be exactly what she had always hoped it would be, but it was real, and it was moving in the right direction, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that was enough. She pulled on her coat. She looked around her apartment, the apartment she had paid for herself, the life she had built herself, the person she had slowly been building into someone she could stand to be. Outside the window, the February sky was the particular pale blue that comes before weather changes, and the trees were still bare but beginning to show the faintest thickening at the branch ends that would eventually become buds. Not yet, but coming. Emily locked her door and went out into the cold and walked toward the rest of her life. Emily did not win by screaming. She did not win by burning everything down. She won by finally deciding that her voice was worth using and that the truth was worth protecting, even when the people she loved were too comfortable with the lie to thank her for it. Before you go, I want to ask you this one honest question. Is there someone in your life who has been treating your loyalty like it has no limit and your presence like it has no cost? Drop your answer in the comments below. You might be surprised how many people are reading the same chapter of the same story.